Good evening, everyone. So I'm really glad that we can be here for what will be a fantastic conversation during this Black History Month. How lucky are we to be in conversation with leaders in our community like Tane, Marcus, and Tawanna. I am Neera Chatterjee. I am a board member of WILD and a champion of our economic justice work. In my day job, I'm an attorney at US Bank, and I support our corporate social responsibility and DEI teams. This work is very close to my heart. So I'm gonna spend a couple minutes talking to you about WILD and the Westminster Town Hall Forum and introducing Tane, and then we'll get to the heart of the evening. So first off, WILD's vision is to create a Twin Cities community free of anti-Black racism and all forms of racism. WILD's mission is to provide a platform through which Twin Cities Diversity in Practice members can actively combat anti-Black racism and all forms of racism through direct support and partnerships with existing community organizations currently rooted in this work. Essentially, WILD organizes free legal help for racial equity initiatives and puts on free educational programs around issues that disparately impact BIPOC communities. A little bit about the Westminster Town Talks. Since 1980, the Westminster Town Hall Forum has hosted free and open public talks by some of the most important and inspiring speakers in the world. Their mission is to invite voices of conscience to address the issues of the day from an ethical perspective. Town Talks is the forum's program featuring local speakers who grapple with issues important to the Twin Cities, the region, and the state of Minnesota. Like their national speaker programs, Town Talks addresses these topics from an ethical perspective. But unlike the nationally focused forums, Town Talks recruits innovative leaders from within the Minnesota community who are actively engaged in solving sticky problems in our cities and around the state. And just like all forum programs, Town Talks events are entirely free and open to all. WILD, the Westminster Town Hall Forum, and Tane Danger have a strong partnership. We've partnered on multiple public safety programs, including a conversation here at Westminster last summer with 3 relatively new elected and appointed public safety officials. In 2021, Tane moderated a program with WILD on the Minneapolis City Ballot Question 2, a new Department of Public Safety. We're really excited to partner again today for a discussion around Black wealth generation. Tane Danger has served as director of the Westminster Town Hall since 2020. In addition to his work with the forum and as an event conversation host, he regularly teaches and does workshops on better dialogue and collaboration through improv. Tane is the rare mix of professional improv comedy performer with a master's in public policy. He believes in making big, important conversations fun and accessible to diverse audiences. So, let's have some fun.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to have you all here at Westminster. Thank you so much for joining us. That was a beautiful, lovely introduction. And so I am going to just move right us along into welcoming our 2 amazing panelists. I really am looking forward to getting to talk to them, and particularly on this subject that we're trying to do tonight. So first up, and I'll do these relatively briefly because we're actually going to spend quite a bit of time tonight talking about the amazing work that each of these individuals does. Tawanna Black is the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion. That organization has been working with literally tens of thousands of business leaders, philanthropists, community leaders, government folks for since 2017. Thank you very much. 2017, both here in Minnesota and increasingly all over the country. And their work is to help those companies and nonprofits and government organizations create equitable talent and supply chain and marketing strategies. Tawanna Black is one of the most amazing people I've ever met. She is a Bush Fellow. We were actually Bush Fellows together. The difference is that she went and made something of herself. So please, a big round of applause for Tawanna Black as she comes on up. Marcus Owens, also amazingly wonderful human being, although we only met today, so I'm basing that both on his bio and the wonderful conversation we had before this program. He's a social entrepreneur who's worked in corporate and nonprofit leadership roles. He spent a decade in the community development sector. He was the director of the African American Leadership Forum for many years, as well as the president and CEO of the Northside Economic Opportunity Network. Also, a former Bush Fellow, I learned this evening. So please, a big round of applause for Marcus Owens. So, we have a lot to do tonight. We are going to try and understand a lot more than we do even now about Black wealth barriers and opportunities in Minnesota and beyond. And to help get us started, actually, Tawanna, look at how prepared she is. She's got a PowerPoint with her ready to go to give us sort of like a grounding in this work and what the Center for Economic Inclusion is all about. So take it away, Tawanna.
Thank you so much for that, Tane, and thank you all for being here this evening. I could not be more excited to be able to spend the evening, not only with Tane and Marcus, two amazing friends, but also with all of you. And to help kick off our conversation on tonight, I'm going to share just a few kind of frameworks and facts as well to help us ground ourselves on this evening. So to get started, I should have asked a question before I came up here. Am I changing or somebody else is changing? Fantastic. Thank you so much, Keith. It makes sense to ask those questions in advance, but we'll work without tonight. So a little bit about the Center for Economic Inclusion. As Tane just noted, our work is really about helping corporations, policymakers take hold of their actions by first looking inside and then transforming themselves. And we'll talk more about that. So I'm actually going to skip down to slide number 4, if you could, Keith. The ways that we think about this work, as you all know, we have racial wealth gaps. We have racial employment gaps, wage gaps. But more than that, we believe that it's not important that we just close gaps, but that we really create a place where all people can excel in our economy, where they can write their own stories of economic mobility and prosperity, and that as we write our own stories, because we've removed those systemic barriers, people are contributing to the economy in ways that incentivize and motivate all of us to go beyond the things that we might do because it's the right thing, but to do those things because it's good for everyone. And at the center, we're really committed, as Tane noted, thousands of people, and giving people, at least 20,000 people, in fact, the tools to be able to do that, to create an inclusive economy for 3 million people over the next few years. Why to do that in Minneapolis-St. Paul is in part because our geography is changing. Our demographics are changing, if we look at the next slide. And as we do that, it doesn't just mean that our workforce changes. It also means that the way that we relate to different people has to change simultaneously. The way that companies think about selling to different communities has to change. We have to make sure our products and our services are more responsive to each one of those different populations. But doing that goes beyond simply having faces of people who are different. It requires us to understand, why have we failed at this in the first place? And that's the work that we take on. And the next slide, as we think about an inclusive regional economy, one where all people prosper, but in particular, thinking about WILD's mission, where we've uprooted anti-Black racism, it requires us to think about the places and ways that each one of us engage with the economy today. Our jobs are a part of that. Housing is another part of that. Transportation between our jobs, our houses, and the amenities that we want to take advantage of all go into thinking about how the economy works. And if you think back to one of those prior slides, being able to be economically mobile, meaning that our children's children benefit from the investments that we make in ourselves and in our businesses today, that we can see that generational transfer of wealth, requires us going to the roots to understand, why do we not have that on today, and what would it take to be able to create an inclusive regional economy? On the next slide, we highlight in our organization several years ago, we began producing indicators of an inclusive regional economy. You can take advantage of that QR code if you haven't seen those indicators before. But we felt like it was important for people to not only know about gaps, but to really understand what's behind those gaps. What are the levers that we have to pull in every industry and sector? In the banking industry, how do we pull levers that help us understand wages? How would we pull levers that help us understand lending to different communities, neighborhoods? As was noted earlier, Marcus focused on North Minneapolis for some time. Ensuring that businesses are prospering in that neighborhood is important. If we could go through the next couple of slides, you can just go through them at your own pace as we go down to slide 13, we just want to give you a taste of those indicators that you can go and visit, but we find that it's important, and we produce these because it's important that we disaggregate data, that we start to understand who do we mean when we say Asian people are thriving in the economy and have jobs. Are all Asian people, or are some Asian people? If we break that down beyond race, we're able to understand the ethnic impacts of our policies, our systems, our belief systems. The same is true for Black people as we think about our economy and how people are faring, not only with jobs and employment or wages, but business ownership. Thinking about our experience in lending practices that lead to business expansion and the creation of jobs. And more than that, what's our experience of racism in our community? Work done by APM Research that we note in the indicators found that a significant portion of people of color and a gross percentage of African Americans said, I do still experience racism in my community, in my workplace. I can see things that are happening where I can't trace a source for that beyond race. So it's important for us, as people who live in the same community, to have conversations that help us understand what that looks like. In our work, we also find it's important to invest in the capital that's required for businesses to be able to grow. If Black-owned businesses today earned revenue with on parity with their white-owned peers, more than $190 billion would come into our economy. Studies show, done by the Federal Reserve Bank, that much of the disparate impact isn't due to credit score, it isn't due to accomplishments within the business, but traces itself back to racism. That means when two people walk into a bank and seek a loan and provide their information, more often than not, white lenders are offered the capital that they need in excess of what they've actually asked for, and African American borrowers are offered capital at significantly lower than not only what they've asked for, but what they need and what statistics would suggest they deserve. That doesn't just hurt that business and the employees that they could hire, it harms our entire economy. We recognize the need to help us understand that in order to continue to move forward. To that end, we've been investing in Black and Latina and Indigenous-owned businesses throughout our region and proven, if you look at this slide here, through a model that focuses on ensuring that capital is available, that connections are available, that we're investing in the capacity of those businesses to serve our business community. We found in just investments made in 8 businesses last year, more than 15 jobs created by those businesses at jobs that pay more than $33 an hour. Simply by investing in connections, in the network to be able to take advantage of contracts, the capital that's needed through forgivable loans, the capacity that's needed to understand more things about the landscape that would lead to greater access to more resources and relationships, and ensuring that ultimately contracts that were pledged by companies and local governments just a few years ago actually take place in our community, not only to businesses across the country, but right here in Minnesota. If we could go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about, I'm actually 2 slides down, I've talked about that one some. We'll talk about ways that we're helping businesses that many of you may work with and for take accountability for changing their culture and their workplace. At the center, we heard from many people over a number of years that they wanted to do better, but didn't always know exactly what that roadmap was to moving from a good DEI program to one that's specifically addressing racism and doing so in a way that impacts the economy. Our answer for that is the Racial Equity Dividends Index. You can take advantage of that either online or out in the lobby. And it's a tool to be able to help businesses and local governments measure their impact. When we study this, we look at studies across the country that have been used to measure gender equity, LGBTQ equity and inclusion inside the workplace, disability equity and inclusion in the workplace, but race has been an area largely untapped. In order for us to take full advantage of the promise of America, we have to understand those policies and practices and behaviors that get in the way of systemic inclusion, of belonging in our workplaces. So far, to date, over 51 businesses in Minnesota have participated in the index since 2022, and these employers are important because they impact more than 200,000 employees. They impact consumers. You, based on being here, have told us that you care about anti-Black racism. Over 90% of Americans have said, my company needs to do better at this, and it's impacting how I choose where I work, where I purchase from. So these standards help businesses learn to take different actions in their work. 23 local governments, city and county governments, Met Council participated in the first public sector version of this. This is critical because these are the people who help shape the way that we live, shape the public commons, shape the ways that our land is developed and transportation corridors are developed, the housing that is built in our communities, how public investments of federal and state dollars flow back into our community to make it uphold the values that we believe in. These cities and counties and regional governments and organizations serve over 3 million Minnesotans and employ more than 31,000 people. It's critical that the way they employ those people is really resolving for and solving for racism, but more than that, that it's getting at the heart of inclusion and belonging in ways that impact economic mobility. And that's the work that we do in this next slide by giving them several categories from leadership to hiring, retention, and advancement, procurement, philanthropy, and our public policies in the marketplace to understand how to take actions that truly will transform not only the workplace, but also our communities. Lastly, I remind us of the chilling effect that we're experiencing all across the country right now. Individuals who want to take us back to a place where racism is commonplace, is not covert, but is overt, are well orchestrated, well resourced, and well strategized in order to not only ensure that progress doesn't happen economically, but that it doesn't happen socially, mentally, physically in our communities. And that means that organizations like WILD and others who are gathered here have to be not just as intentional, but even more intentional, even more resourced, even more powerful in order to ensure that the progress we have made, which isn't significant when we look at economics, but the progress we have made can be maintained and move forward. And that's the basis of the work that we're doing, and I look forward to that conversation with my colleagues right here today.
Big round of applause. So I should say, I've got a bunch of questions, then we're going to have a conversation. There's also cards on your table, and so throughout the program, if there's something that sparks a question or curiosity for you, please write that down. Some of our friends from WILD are going to be keeping an eye out for that, and they'll look for the cards, and they'll bring some of those forward for us to bring those into the conversation as well. Thank you both for being here. There was so much already in the presentation and what we're trying to talk about. I kind of wanted to start with maybe just a few definitional terms, like to make sure that we're kind of all talking about the same thing, because we've talked already about income, we've talked about wealth, we've talked about employment, and so can we even just like maybe those first two, when we talk about building wealth versus building income, maybe that's easy for some folks, but I think that it's important, particularly in like what we're talking about here, which is actually building wealth, Black wealth for this conversation. So can we, I don't know, do you want to jump?
Okay.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah.
Good? Okay,
Yeah.
you can hear me. Great. Building
Get
wealth.
really close to it.
Building wealth is
Try.
it's not. Okay, you can take that one. How about that? Hey, can you hear me now? Good. Okay. So building wealth is a big concept. It's not one-dimensional where you can just look at financial assets. Over the past decade or so, the work that I've done with communities in the Black community, particularly in North Minneapolis and across the Twin Cities here, is that wealth is much more broad. Folks, in particular, as we've been working with Family Housing Fund on Black home ownership, we talked to aspiring home buyers, and they've talked about their home that they want to buy is more than just an asset, but they want it to be grandma's house. They want it to be a place where they can commune and they can bring their family together. Folks talked about health being part of wealth building. They've talked about social connection and cohesion. They've talked about being in safe and affordable neighborhoods as being part of their wealth journey. And wealth isn't a destination. for many people. It is a journey, and you go back and forth between stages of survival, stability, mobility, beginning to leverage your assets, beginning to think about affluence. But you can go back and forth, and folks see this as a journey, not as a destination, right? And then I think about some of the components that are the barriers that people see. And, historical trauma, Tawanna mentioned some of this stuff, redlining and disproportionate discriminatory practices in lending are all things that still impact us today. It's generational. It's embedded in many of our DNAs, right? So we can't think about the past as being the past. It's still the present. Other components to it, networks, like how networked you are, whether you have people that are also on the same path that you are or can connect you to places you haven't been connected to before. And then the criminal justice system still impacts us constantly. If you're in a state of survival and you're constantly building fees and fines and different things like this, and that goes onto your record, you can't get the job that you deserve. You can't get the house or the housing that you deserve. So all these things are still impacting us, right? And so when you think about wealth, it's broader than just the acquisition of financial assets.
I think Marcus nailed that, but I want to just underscore something that he started with, is that wealth is dollars. It is. Sometimes we think it's other things and we take that off the table, but it's also political wealth. It's the social wealth. It's the intellectual wealth. It's the physical wealth of an individual. And to me, wealth is choice. It's having those assets across those dimensions so that a person, a family, has choice about where they live, choice about where they work, about how they operate, about what health decisions that they make every day, about what job decisions they make. And if we can really define it in those terms of it's having all of the different assets across the dimensions so that you have choice.
And so we're here, we're talking about building black wealth in Minnesota, building wealth in Minnesota. And part of this conversation is sparked by the fact that Minnesota and the Twin Cities has some of the widest gaps between white people and people of color in terms of both income and wealth and home ownership and a variety of other places anywhere in the country. This is a huge question, why? And then why does it persist?
So we tend to talk about the belief gap, certainly in education. Marcus worked for ALF that had a paper focused on the belief gap as one of the gaps that keeps our children from being able to matriculate in the ways that we would expect them to, given the great education system in Minnesota. Belief gaps also exist when it comes to wealth. If we have belief gaps that go back to our founding as a country, and I believe we do, then we tend to make decisions every day in our organizations that perpetuate those belief gaps. If I don't believe that you are as equal as I am, then I might get by with paying you a little bit less than I would pay someone who looked like me. And the data shows that's what happens inside our organizations every day. If I don't believe that you deserve a home loan, or I don't believe that you deserve a business loan, then I may choose to not make that, not based on the criteria, but simply based on a subconscious or conscious belief. And often these things, it's important to note, we're not only talking about the overt and the conscious decisions, but the subconscious beliefs that based on America's history, that where we chose, but we didn't choose, white people in America chose to go steal and enslave black bodies in order to build wealth. It didn't start as an issue of hate. It started as an issue of greed, wanting to make money and accumulate wealth, where we're going to then continue to see that, sadly, for now hundreds of years, still in our DNA and in our decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And kind of connected to that, too, we have to think about like how systems interact. Systems are meant to isolate and create a standard, and oftentimes they're not adaptable. And so you have communities that have tried to, build a way here, but if they don't adapt to the system's approach or the standard that the system creates, then they're often left out. And then some of those same systems create unnecessary barriers, such as taking out an entire neighborhood in St. Paul when 94 comes through Warando neighborhood, right? Like there is concerted reasons why the gaps exist, because every time there's progress, there's something that either creates a barrier or strips and eliminates the wealth that was created.
Well, and to build on this belief gap that you were talking about, I wonder, to tie that again back to this place that we are in, and if there's part of that for somewhere like Minnesota where we have a narrative, we are a northern progressive place that generally has done the right thing, X, Y, and Z in terms of government and business and whatnot. So of course we must be doing the right thing, which then potentially blinds us to the places where we fall short.
Absolutely, but it's important to note it doesn't only blind people in positions of power, it also blinds those who are being held back. It blinds Black people from being able to understand, wait a minute, if you're taught all day long, every day, this is a great place, everybody else is thriving, you're just not thriving. Your mother isn't just thriving, your cousins aren't just thriving, there's something else, because look at us, we're winning every award. I think sometimes with the belief gap, we deceive ourselves in not understanding that these beliefs, these mental models, are shared. So then how I approach a job, how I approach education, how I approach my physician, and this has been proven time and time again by many outfits, is going to be limited with a different view, particularly in a place like Minnesota, where it is progressive, right? It feels like all people are welcome here. Maybe it's me that I just can't figure out how to navigate this system until I wake up to say, actually, the system is not broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to keep me in a place of believing I deserve less than, I'm capable of less than, and then I've got to work to overcome that. That's not an overnight step.
Yeah. The center has been around for 7 years now, and both in terms of this belief question, but then just in the work generally. I'm curious how that's grown, how you see it differently, the response that you get, how that's changed over that time.
Excellent question. I think there are cycles and flows, right? I would say right now, many people are asking us, well, Tawanna, well, CEI, are companies pulling back? Are they going back from the urgency that arose after George Floyd was murdered and throughout COVID, when we suddenly realized, wait, are we all actually in the same boat? Because we're all struggling at home, right? To be able to not only provide, but to make it while educating children and working. What we'd say is that, yes, we've taken some steps back, but they're not back to a new place. They're back to where we were. So when the center was founded, it was really under this notion that companies aspired to do the right thing and yet had proven time and time again, not so. Our results, our data shows, not just the centers, but across the nation, that Minnesota is failing in this way. But not failing despite programs, not failing, or without programs, I should say, but failing despite programs, despite initiatives, despite dollars, which meant we had to go deeper in the DNA. I'd say today, I referenced the index earlier, we do see a number of people and leaders and companies who are saying, we've got to change this around, but it's a slow turn, and that's where I'd emphasize again, we have to be more accelerated, more aggressive in our efforts if we truly want to have the next generation with a different experience.
Yeah. I mean, Marcus, you define yourself social entrepreneur, and I'm curious how that has intersected with this work, right? That role in our community.
Yeah, so quick social entrepreneur definition, right? I'm really someone that's looking for opportunities to create social impact and not necessarily focus on the bottom line components, right? And so many of us here, if you're thinking about creating social change, you're a social entrepreneur as well. So accept that title, take it, you can put it on your LinkedIn, whatever you need to do. But ultimately, we're looking to use the same strategies that business would use, such if you think about sectors such as climate, resilience, or healthcare, or education, like they're taking innovative and rigorous approaches to solving some of these problems. We have to do the same thing for racial equity, right? And so when I think about my career, when I think about the last 10 years of doing this work, it's about building institutions. How do you go into an institution, develop the necessary resources and infrastructure so that it can endure and be at the community level and at the system level, because we need different players at different places doing the work, right? And so now, you know, as I'm developing a consultancy practice, I get to work with multiple organizations. I get to work with nonprofits and small businesses that are at the community level and help them develop their infrastructure. I get to work with philanthropy, government, and corporate to help them think about how they connect to and translate what they want to do with community. Not for community or to community, but with community, right? Sometimes these connections have been what's missing in our sector. So I think about it like that. But ultimately, we need the 501c3s, the C4s, we need social enterprises and traditional models to solve these problems.
There's something so interesting to that with what both of you are talking about, where we're talking about this from a very economic lens in some ways, and the sort of premise, I think, for a lot of people, and literally in some legal context, like the premise of a business is to make money, right? Like is to have a profit and make money for shareholders. And both of you are complicating that and saying there are these other factors that must be part of this, and they aren't separate from that thing, but they complicate it or they add to it. And so I'm wondering for each of you, like how you think about both how that works together, that traditional idea of what a business or an enterprise is, and then whether it's the social entrepreneurship part or the work of the center, how that, again, complicates the picture.
Yeah. Well, capital has to be in play here. You have to have capital to operate. You need employees, you need systems, you need infrastructure, like all these parts and pieces to allow the work to happen, right? And oftentimes the organizations that I work with are underfunded, they're under-resourced, and so they're doing with less. And so they start to develop, well, what else do I have to offer? What else do I have to do? And why I'm here? What's the purpose of me being here if it's not to be a millionaire, right? It's to create change in community. And so working with entrepreneurs for 5 years in North Minneapolis, all those entrepreneurs were trying to find a way to serve their community. They wanted to be the barber or open the restaurant or open the cleaning business that they could do within their community because they knew their community needed that. And so oftentimes these small businesses become refuge for community members. They become center places. They become places that are hubs. And so they're making profit or they're doing things to make profit, but they're also thinking about all the other things that they can do. And I think that's just embedded in the African American community is that we're a collective. We're thinking about each other and not the individual or the American way of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and create your own individual path. It's like, do that, but do it in a way that's in a collective with other people, because now I feel like I'm feeling purpose. I'm reaching those higher levels of attainment for myself. But it's more than just money. Like money has to be a part of it, but we have to invert the equation where money's just an input, not an output.
Great perspective, Marcus. I think it's also important for us to go back in history. So often in our communities, we see a program of NEON, for instance, a program that's designed to be able to help spur economic growth. We see a program focused on jobs, and we think, okay, that's new. Introduce Black people to that way of operating. In reality, that is the way that Black Americans have operated from day one. So whether first being stolen from our native land and brought here, where women buried seeds from their native country in their hair in order to be able to come here and plant those seeds such that we have vegetables we would not have otherwise had on American soil, right? Entrepreneurship, innovation, but doing so with the lens of, I actually have no idea where I'm going. I need to be sure not just I can eat, but my family can eat, right? So that lens for it. As slavery was abolished, the first thing to do was to create businesses. Black businesses were created throughout the South, and then as people matriculated and migrated north, created as well. Why? Because Black people could not take advantage of insurance, housing, other services from white-owned businesses. Those businesses led to the creation of our corridors. So it's important to understand that early mindset because that's still in our DNA, to Marcus's point, that yes, we're making dollars and cents. Yes, we're creating jobs that help other people make more dollars and cents. But at the root of it is what we learned from our ancestors, which was this is how you also build community. This is how you create jobs that then allow people to purchase homes, that then allow people to invest in their children's education, all those things that segregation forced us to learn early, but done throughout the DNA that was brought here.
Thank you folks who are submitting questions from the audience. And we got one, and I think that it's very much tied to this. It kind of brings us very much into the present from this big historical perspective. But the person is asking, how do we overcome the mountains of paperwork which are required by law to start businesses, get a loan, and do a lot of the entrepreneurship or expanding of an organization that we're talking about here? That's kind of, again, making it very practical in some ways to today, what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the essence of it is that the systems has tried to make it difficult for you to start a business, to be in commerce. And there's some things that are necessary so that you know that people are in good standing and are doing right by communities that they're doing business in. That makes a lot of sense. But how do you start to remove barriers? How do you create hubs where people that want to start businesses can go, get what they need, and then start their business? Because it's really about the business, it's not about the paperwork, right? And so organizations such as NEON, such as META, such as the Black Chamber are helping businesses day in and day out create those pathways so that they can eliminate those barriers and streamline a lot of work that needs to be done. And oftentimes, they're just touching the surface of the potential of the businesses that are out there. We did a survey when I was at NEON, and we were working with META and others. We surveyed 500 BIPOC businesses in Minnesota, across the state. And of the 500, only 10% knew who we were. So it's like, how you think about, like, people are out there trying to start businesses every day, but how do you create the access points so that these hubs actually can do what they're meant to do? And that's to remove those barriers. It's to streamline and create opportunities so folks can go out and do their brilliant ideas or their ways to create opportunities for other people in the community by hiring them and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go out on a limb here, and you all tell me if you concur, like push back on this, but I'm wondering if part of what we're getting at here is that opening that up sometimes is not about creating a new program or a new system. It's actually about pulling back or like opening up a space that kind of, there's already energy and there's already people there. And our brains, I think, automatically go to like, oh, well, you got to create some sort of like system or program or government agency to do this. But I think that what we're saying here is, well, maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah, I would echo that. In Minnesota, there are more than 15,000 medical companies. 15,000 medical companies in Minnesota. And yet, if Marcus and I were to go open a business that sounded even remarkably similar tomorrow, not only would white people say, well, my God, why'd they do that? Shouldn't one of them just go work for the other one? But black people would too. Again, back to that belief system. But in Minnesota, we've decided we are going to be the capital of innovation in the medical field. We're going to be that capital for it, not only in direct service care, but in medical technology, in a number of different other arenas. And we take pride in that because we recognize it can create jobs, it can create revenue that doesn't only come from Minnesotans, but from all across the country. We have to be able to think the same way here. I think that question that you ask around the paperwork is an important one, but I find having opened a corporation, an LLC, and a nonprofit while living in Minnesota, it's less a barrier about the paperwork and the bundles required to start a business and more about what's required to scale that business, to become certified, to operate within a supply chain, to be able to go from one company to the next company to the next company if you're B2B, and be able to navigate that. It's the zoning paperwork if you're trying to open up an actual storefront in a business and understanding, wait, I'd like to purchase this property, but all of the hoops I've got to go through and the length of time it takes to get through them is precluding me from being able to open that business and operate. Those are places where we've got to get more intentional and then more intentional about capital. Dollar flows into every business that exists today. Every business from somewhere, whether that is seed capital from a family that's been able to build wealth because of, most often, our communities, and not just in Minnesota, but across the nation, racism within those systems, or it's investor capital from a number of different individuals or institutions, but our ability to continue to seed businesses that are owned by black people so that they do scale to having a significant number of employees and are able to continue to participate in the economy, that's where we've been lax. That's where we've said it's risky, but the data proves our businesses outperform the mainstream business. And so it's not about risk. On paper, it's not about dollars and cents risk. It's about a mental risk of what will happen when these businesses thrive.
You referenced this in the opening presentation, but the center does a lot of work around investing in Black and Latina women-owned businesses. And it's a very interesting thing because you're working on two sides of this. You're both investing in those businesses, but then also trying to get them into the supply chains of some of these other. Can you just talk about what that model is and sort of how that works?
Sure. So to your point, it's not our typical side of the equation, but we found as we worked with corporations and local governments on diversifying their supply chain that too many said, that business doesn't exist. I want to spend dollars in this lane. Here's the product or service I need to purchase, but there's no one in that lane. Or there's one, but I need there to be 2 to 3 choices for me to be able to do business with them. And so as we had an opportunity to secure funding, we thought this is the place to go to be sure that not only are we creating businesses, but we're scaling them. And what we heard in our communities with our partners, Certified Access, Chanter is in the room, I believe, also. So we had partners who were out there working with communities and telling us, wait a minute, folks are creating businesses. They're working to scale them, but too often they stay earning less than $100,000 in annual revenues, and that could last you 10, 20 years. And so we needed solutions, not just the training, but the capital to scale that. And so we've chosen to invest not only in an accelerator that helps provide the training and support, but to wrap around that with our team, connecting people to contract opportunities and seeing them through that opportunity so they continue to grow and scale, and then doing forgivable loans that range between $25,000 to $500,000 into a business so that they're getting the resources they need. Sometimes to stay between a contract, you go for that RFP, but you've got to have staff to win it. Paying them while you don't have the work is difficult unless you've got capital. And so forgivable loan can help with that. Sometimes it's about technology or bricks and mortar that are required to be able to grow. And so these dollars have helped, and we're proving that it works. It's a short-term solution that works and helps businesses grow and scale.
Am I correct? There's been some legal challenges to programs like this, not your program explicitly, but since we have, I know, several lawyers in the room, can you talk a little bit about what those legal challenges have been, and then sort of like how you fight back against that, or
Yeah, absolutely. I think it couldn't be more important for an audience like this to understand the challenges that exist, certainly for those who have actually filed lawsuits, but for any of us who have been intentional in using data that tells us these are the populations we should be focused on and investing in, and then having people who oppose that and say, wait a minute, I'm going to sue you. And I would argue that most of the lawsuits that we see, not only against the Fearless Fund, gosh, I'm tearing on the brain, the Fearless Fund, are not only, but also the barriers that are put in place to encourage people to not have this intentionality. The fear that is created when a lawsuit comes against any of the organizations doing this great work is significant. The fear that comes in my organization when somebody sends an email and says, well, if I'm white, can I still apply? Given that we know that the institutions who are filing these lawsuits are planting people in order to get you to say something that gives them an opportunity to then sue. And it's not as though the lawsuit is the fear factor because it's going to shut the program down. The lawsuit is the fear factor because it's going to consume dollars and cents and time that needs to go toward dismantling systemic racism and investing in growing and scaling these businesses. And frankly, that's why everyone, not just in this room, but across our country, should care about this, should be using their legal time and services to give back to organizations so they're not having to purchase that legal advice, that representation, but have partners in it with them to know, how do I respond to that inquiry? How do I encourage my businesses who are going for contracts to respond when that question asks, what's your racial or ethnic background? Many people are scared to answer that in this climate. They don't know, is that so that I get in the supply chain, or is that so that I get kicked out of the supply chain? So having effective legal advice is critical at this moment.
Yeah, and I think tied to that, I mean, this is all about affirmative action being overturned, last year.
Absolutely.
Right, and the fact that, there was so much debate around whether or not we need affirmative action. Affirmative action was all about college education, right, and applications. But you can see the trickle-down effects when we don't protect the progress that we made, right? It's not just about one aspect. It actually has application across industries, across sectors, if we don't protect the progress. I mean, I think about the affirmative action era, and I think about Reconstruction. Those two areas, we were just down in Alabama, and if you guys, I'm just gonna put a plug in for the CEI right now. They do this reckoning tour, and you go down and see this pathway of civil rights and all the things that happen that you read in the books. But the things that you learn is, like, there was so many times in which our legal system could have protected Black people, and they chose not to. And actually, they went against Black people, right? And affirmative action is one of those things that everyone says, well, it's equal. I've got Black people in my office. No, that's not what it's about. It's about protecting that access. It's about protecting the progress that is being made so that we do have an equitable and equal society here in America. So, like, think about that from a legal perspective. What are you doing to protect the progress that we've made?
I mean, you might have already given the answer for this, but there's a card right here from someone in the audience that asks, the justice system supports systemic racism, often while claiming rule of law is disinterested or non-biased. So they want to know, how do you pierce that pillar and get actual results?
I think it's important for us when we talk about systems and systemic racism. It's just like when you talk about your culture at your workplace. The culture isn't upheld by one person or two people. It's upheld by everybody, or it's changed by people who rally and make a change. Systems are upheld by people, or they are changed by people. So when we talk about piercing the justice system, we have to pierce both the hearts and the minds and the hands of people who are upholding that system today. We have to have the dialogues and the journeys, like the Reckoning Tour we're doing, that helps people really understand, wait a minute, it was admitted that the war on drugs was specifically designed to label Black people as predators. It wasn't about drugs being good or bad. It was designed because America was starting to say, okay, maybe black people are like us. Maybe all people are created equal. Let us have a war on drugs that helps us paint black men in particular as predators so that the world fears them and puts more laws in place. When you can see the facts of our history, then we start to pierce the mind, we start to pierce the heart. Then we have to equip people with, okay, what is the alternative? And what are we leaving on the table while we don't? I'd love it if people would make these changes just because of the heart. I'd love it, but it's not reality. We've proven for hundreds of years that's not enough, so we have to give people the facts and imperatives for what is at risk when we continue to have a justice system that is purposefully harming black people, and then make it simple. What are 1, 2, or 3 things that each one of us can do inside our institutions that are harming right now? How do we change that harm?
Yeah, and kind of connected to that, so we've done some work with an initiative called Rooted to Last, and we've laid out this framework that kind of identifies these 3 levers of power, whereas individual power, when that individual power starts to collect with others, they start to develop practices. Those practices, after time, are embedded to become policy, right? And it's this vicious cycle. And there's states of being where if you're aware, you start to analyze, you start to take action, and then you start to be accountable, you can start to shift that, right? And so those mental models, those things that are imperfect about our systems have to be brought to light. They have to be analyzed, but we have to take action. We can't just keep going back and forth between awareness and analysis, awareness and analysis. We have to take action and then have to be accountable. Because if we're accountable, we can start to take that power and start to shift those practices and shift policy that we can begin again to protect so that we can keep going through this cycle so that we, start to shift the way that the system works for all of us.
And I think one of the things I hear you both saying is that this can't be one sector's job, right? And again, I think that that's something that we can all easily fall into, where we think, oh, well, this is a legal problem, and so if we do the right lawsuit, we'll figure this out. Or it's a government problem, so if we pass the right law, we'll figure it out. But what I'm hearing you all say is this is those plus a culture problem, plus a history problem, plus just how do we interact with one another as individuals problem. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. To that point of connecting the dots, I think it's important that we give people the tools to know that it takes all that undoing. Before you can build a new system, we've got to undo the current system. So a legal community comes in play there to be able to identify, oh, this is the law. I've had attempts happen with the center, and I'm able to send it to my attorneys, and you're able to pull that back for me and say, no, point 1, point 2, point 3. Well, the more keenly aware you are of that, then you're not just solving for the Center for Economic Inclusion. You start to look for, wait a minute, where's this bias built into every law? Where is it built into the system? And what onus do I take to undo that while also making people more aware of it?
I was actually just happened to be, I'm going to pull it since we talked about various different sectors that are involved with this. We've talked about legal sector. We were also referencing government, which I know both of you have intersected with in different ways. I was talking with someone today who works in government somewhere here in Minnesota, and they were very excited about this program. They might be watching the live stream right now because they're like, we talk about this a lot when we are trying to figure out how to do projects right. When we are talking about making an investment in some infrastructure project in a new community or in a place. And they said that they hear this, exact kind of thing where they hear folks say, they get nervous about oh, you're going to do an investment in my community? Does that mean that you're going to make it so I won't be able to afford living in my community anymore? Will this displace me? Will this create gentrification? And so, I don't know, I know you've done a lot of work in the North Side, and I'm curious how you think about how government does things like investment, whether that's in, housing, business, transportation, whatever it is, and if there's sort of best practices for doing it right.
Best practices. That's interesting. It's hard because government historically does not have a really good relationship with community. Particularly in the black community, North Minneapolis, there's always something happening that the community feels like they have to defend themselves for, right? Right now, the Blue Line is the biggest thing. And the Blue Line, this is rapid transit, light rail, and it's been on debate for the last 10 or 15 years now around where this is gonna go. And everyone thought it was settled where it was going to go. And after much engagement and much back and forth, we felt like it was settled. But then it wasn't. and then they came back. And decisions started to happen really fast. And I know folks in the county that they felt like they went out and they had sessions and they did focus groups and things like that. But it's not touching the masses of folks in community. And so their natural stance is defensive because it's happened before. You've put 94 through St. Paul and also the north side. You've separated us from the river. You've created 100. Now we're separated from the west side. You've actually put North Minneapolis on an island, literal concrete island, because of decisions that government's made. So anytime government comes in to try to engage, and they try to do it with folks that may have come from the community, but it's too late and too little. So how do we think about relationships with community well in advance of decisions and bringing them into the processes so that they can be more civically engaged? Now, civic engagement, though, is tied to your economic opportunity. If you're still in survival and you're not even into stability, you're not civically engaged. You're just trying to put food on the table, right? So all of this stuff is connected. So yes, folks want to make change. Yep, this is going to enhance your community. But to that question, is this going to push me out now? Yeah. Is this going to look different? Because I'm comfortable with what I have right now, even though I want more. But I want to be a part of that change and give me an opportunity ahead of it.
I totally hear that, and I just as you said, like that is one example where that project has been in limbo for 10 to 15 years, and so I hear that, and you want to do it. That's why I asked about trying to do it right, because you also, I think, don't want to end up in the other space where you get paralyzed, where like there's no way to do this right, and so then you don't do anything. That seems wrong too.
Yeah, you really, it's investing in not just in government engagement, but how do you find the organizations and the people that are engaging in community daily and bringing them into the fold so that they can have real conversations together about what they want to see in their communities, right? And so, for instance, there's a group of business owners on West Broadway right now that they want to see it because they feel like this is an opportunity for them, but their voices have been drowned out. And so looking for ways outside of government, outside of your corporations, to partner with organizations such as CEI and others that already have those relationships established. And then they can start to bring these stories and these narratives in a way that can actually bring truth, but also bring confidence in what could be possible if we actually look at what it could come out of this.
If I could, I think one of the other opportunities we have here, and you asked for best practices, if you look at our public sector index report, you'll find the standards that we offer to local governments. But often what I say to people who are stuck here is, do what you do for white communities and neighborhoods, but with a lens for the wealth that has already been extracted out of this black community or neighborhood. Often, too often, we see planners, where I started my career, economic developers, where I spent another part of it, spending too much time dancing on tiptoes and throwing all of the rules in the playbook out the window. So then, to your point of how it's been 10 to 15 years, why? Development occurs in other neighborhoods on a much faster track. I'm not saying there aren't some times where projects last a long time, but often we're not having to engage people for 15 years, and hello, we still won't break ground for many more to come. Not understanding the trauma that comes along with that, the economic planning, right, the speculation around properties and how those go up or down so that community members can build wealth is irrational for us not to consider those things when we're planning, and then not to apply proper planning principles, proper economic development principles, neighborhood development principles to that. I led at one point in my career a public-private partnership redeveloping a neighborhood in another city. I was amazed, and it's part of what made me believe I could create the center, and needed to, at how much we developed in 3 years. 30 new small businesses, more than 400 million of mixed-use development, totally changing around one-way streets to two-way in 3 years after a 2-year planning process. When business and government want to partner in order to revitalize, to reinvest in, and to build a new future that's driven by the neighborhood, as that particular project and many others across the country were, we can do it. But too often we let race be the thing that tells us, uh-oh, don't know how to do this, so let's go cook it behind the scenes and throw something out, and if it doesn't work, then we say the community never wanted it. They don't want better. Well, no, it's some about the way we're going about it.
Yeah, and again, part of what I feel like I'm hearing you both talk about is that there frankly needs to be empathy and understanding in this, which again is maybe not something that we traditionally or historically like put front and center in how we think about doing business always or doing government planning or whatnot. I'm sure some folks would push back and say, I've been a government planner who's been empathetic my whole life. I know you are all out there, but you're saying like that has to be a systemic thing, that is how you approach a lot of this.
Yeah, we have to want trust, right? Companies, particularly large corporations, measure the trust factor. They measure the trust factor of their consumers and customers and their employees. Think about it similarly as it relates to how we relate to Black communities, communities that we're doing business with, who we want as our customers. Black employees, often companies engage us for engagement, but they haven't talked to their own employees. You want us to go out and ask other people what they might think about you, but you've got a whole audience right back here. They can tell you what's working, what's not working, and what they need to change. If we apply that same logic and just say, wait, if I care about trust over here, I should apply those same principles to trust across the board. But again, we have to acknowledge history to know what trauma we're also undoing, what economic wealth extraction we're undoing at the same time we apply those principles.
And that's such an important point, trust. Like, we did a number of interviews over the past year to just identify like what's wrong with the system and this whole point of engagement. It's really tied to risk. So without relationship and without trust, you equate that to risk, right? When you have relationship and trust, the risk factor goes away. Right, so like that whole point of trust is so important. I want to just underscore that, because without that, we're not going to make any change here, because we're going to perceive it as risky. I don't know it, therefore we can't do it, and we move on.
I'm going to soon get to sort of a lightning round of a bunch of audience questions, but there was actually some news that I was reading today that I wanted to ask you both about. Some statistics came out just recently about this wage gap and employment gap that, again, has been around forever in our country. But there's actually been relatively positive news just in the last year or so. So the unemployment gap between people of color, particularly Black Americans and white Americans, has traditionally been at least 2 times, right? Like it's been twice as large. But just within the last year or so, kind of coming out of 2022, we saw it shrink to 1.5%, which is the smallest that it's ever been. Labor force participation rates, I believe always white Americans had a higher labor force participation rate than Black Americans. We've actually seen that flip. There's a higher percentage in Black Americans participating in the labor force. And the wage gap still persists, but where it used to be, there was a 75 to 80% African Americans, Blacks would make compared to white Americans. That's now shrunk. They're making 84, 85%. And so I think that there's probably a lot of factors that go into this. We have a very tight labor market right now. There was a focus on equity and inclusion coming out of George Floyd's murder. I guess the question I wanted to ask you all with this is, when you see numbers like this, do you see it the start of a trend? Are you optimistic about that? Or, are you like probably a lot of folks where you say, this is so easy to slip away? Like this is maybe just one data point and that's it.
Yeah, great framing of that question. I don't look at it and say it's one data point. I do look at it and say context is everything. Context is everything. In just the last 3 years, the family sustaining wage for Minneapolis-St. Paul moved from $22 to $29. Just a couple of years. And by the way, that means that 2 adults in a home with 2 children, 2.2 children, need to both be earning $29 to afford to live in our region. That doesn't mean to afford to go to the theater. That doesn't mean to be able to afford to take a vacation. That is simply the things that you need to be able to operate here. It moved from $22 to $29. Being employed and the wage gap, when we've already had more than 20 years of a stagnant wage gap that did not move. It moved once in the last 5 years and just again in this latest report. Doesn't equate, right? It does not move to a place where we can look at that and say, all right, good, Black folks are doing good now. All right, enough with that. Let's just somebody keep that program going on in the DEI office. No, we cannot, because we have to look at how far behind were individuals who were going to work every day, often working 2 and 3 jobs in order to get to that $29. The backtrack is significant. We also see, while the labor participation rate has started to close and improve, we also see the jobs and the choices that African Americans are choosing to go into are vastly different than they were pre-pandemic. More individuals choosing to say, I'm going to put together a job in gig places that I want to be in. That choice factor at places and doing work where either I trust it or I trust that I can control it means a big impact on the economy. As we just simply look at the unemployment rate and the vacancy rate, those are often being impacted by people who say, enough already. I'm going to go figure this out myself.
Yeah. And I would kind of call out a couple efforts of that, generate cautious optimism about all of this, right? Because one economic, downturn and all of this could be erased, right? But a couple efforts that have been focusing on really skills-first approaches to workforce development. 110 is a national effort to create 1 million jobs in 10 years for African Americans by removing the 4-year degree requirement. There's many jobs in many corporations and many companies right now that require you to have a 4-year degree that, from a job duty perspective, does not require you to have a 4-year degree, but yet it's on there, and it was on there to create a barrier, to create, a fence between opportunity for someone that may have started to build skills and build experience, maybe in a non-exempt role or in a role that was hourly, but now they're ready for that next leap, but they couldn't do it because they didn't have the 4-year degree, right? And so this skills-first approach is something that I think, if we can get some legs, could actually create some potential pathways. The problem, though, that we're having, and this for the lawyers that are in employee relations, when you're trying to rewrite those job descriptions, what is the hesitation? What are ways in which you can change the status quo and actually help that company? So with the effort, we got a lot of companies to work on that across the country and even here in the Twin Cities, but even still, we were getting job descriptions that come back that said, maybe a 4-year degree would be great. Or, yeah, a 4-year degree or equivalent, experience. And what does equivalent experience actually mean if you don't call it out, right? And so I think that's one strategy. And then the Minnesota network for apprenticeship network that's ran by Aisha McKenzie Collins over at Greater MSP is another great opportunity where folks are looking at the 2-year degree or the associate's degree as a pathway to an apprenticeship that is a pathway to a full-time job. Aon, Accenture, Cargill are all companies that have been piloting these apprenticeship programs where if someone lasts for a whole year and progresses on in that position, they're now qualified for all jobs that require a 4-year degree. So I think this is things that give me hope, but it's still inching away if we don't start to actually change some of those practices inside of our companies.
I want to underscore just the importance of the apprenticeship piece. In Minnesota, 11% of all African Americans are working in home health care aid jobs. Wow. 11%. I heard some ums, so that means you know what those roles pay. And you know that people are having to do 2 or 3 of those roles in order to not again thrive, but just to be able to survive. While we've had numerous workforce development efforts in our region over a number of years that were built to help employers start to career track people up, we find, Indeed published the report on this just a couple of years ago, sadly, that 11% are stuck. They don't have the flexibility, the work benefits, the community supports, and the encouragement of employers to move up that economic track. That's too many people in our state, and that's just one career track, but it's an important one, with 11% of African Americans in our state that has to be transformed. And things like the apprenticeships, things like employers saying, wait a minute, I've got some onus here. What training can I bring in over lunch hours? What training can I bring in immediately after the job? How do I make sure that the job is on a transit route, right? Those simple things that we can start to add that go beyond wages and benefits, but that make a big difference in ensuring people are able to move up that economic ladder, which only helps fill gaps and vacancies that are stagnant in our state.
Okay, I do have several questions from the audience I want to get to. One, and these, because they're from the audience, I have no idea if you know the answers to these. So what is being done to help black farmers thrive? I don't know if either of you have intersected with the agricultural sector and particularly black farmers.
There's a little bit I would note. You mentioned Cargill earlier in your remarks, Marcus, as well. So I do know that organizations like that have some programs that are specifically working to think about the legal challenges that have come as attempts to bring funding to farmers from the USDA, and state programs have been, again, sued and then held up. there are efforts that are happening among corporations who depend on our farming community being thriving and being racially diverse. And those corporations are investing in both the talent, the tools and resources and capital to be able to ensure that farmers overcome that, in particular Black farmers.
Tawanna, you did a nice spot on WCCO TV just before this. Go home and watch the clip of it. It was great. But you mentioned in that you actually spent this morning reading to your child's class. And this question kind of teased that up. What do you believe the youth need to hear to overcome the belief gap? I'm going to give it to Marcus first, maybe. I'm going to give Tawanna a minute here with this.
You know, I've worked with a lot of organizations that work with youth, and the youth tell them what they need. You have to start with asking the youth what they need, what they want, what they aspire to, and what's getting in their way, right? Oftentimes, as adults, we come down to them and say, this is what you need, this is what you have to do, this is where you're going. We don't give them the resources oftentimes. We don't give them the connections. We don't give them what they need to survive or move forward in their life. But starting with asking them, what is it that you need? How can I be a help for you? How can I walk side by side with you? I use the example when my kids were going to school, the principal talked about in elementary school, you're supposed to walk in front of them. When you get to middle school, you're supposed to walk aside of them. And when they get to high school, you walk behind them and you just make sure that they don't fall, right? And like we have to use that metaphor because we're leaving our youth out of the conversation oftentimes that are about decisions about what's happening with them, whether it's in the school districts or it's in the school buildings. How are we bringing youth voice into what's impacting them? And how are we creating opportunities and pathways so that they can, self-determine where their path goes? I'm working with a couple organizations such as Appetite for Change right now, and we had a youth do a vision board for like where they want to go, and then they tell you and they show you what success looks like to them, and it's about being together. It's about determining their own pathways. It's around creating their own creative capital that they can offer to the world, and we just have to be mindful and listen to that.
I think youth need the truth to understand our history. As Marcus noted earlier, the tours that we do with adults, there are some districts who are doing tours like that and taking children from our community on tours to understand our history. And again, not just Black history, but America's history of policies and practices that have led us to this point. They need to understand that there was value. Black youth in particular need to understand there was value in the soil that we came from that continues to run through our veins. As I spoke and read at my children's school, my son's school this morning, I read Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's an excerpt from 1619 Project, Born on the Water. I was impressed by two classes of fifth graders who had phenomenal questions, not only about history, but also about how that ran into our current history. But the first question I received was from a young Black male who said, if Black lives matter, why were we put in slavery? I was so proud of him for being willing to ask that question in front of his peers who will be there left to question him long after I end a 30-minute reading moment. But I was more proud that that led to other questions from many other students in the room and trying to understand history that frankly is not taught accurately or fully in Minnesota schools so that they could then take different actions. The more we stop being scared of conversations with our kids, thinking they don't know, because I can tell you I read my fifth graders' text messages and the racist statements, the derogatory slurs that are used by little fourth and fifth grade children is insane. That starts at home. We can't afford not to tell the truth to our children. We can't afford not to teach them not just the basics of treat everybody nice, but how to value skin color, how to value race, how to not say, oh, I look beyond it and I'm blind to it. No, understand where difference exists and find value in that. We've got to be much more honest because to Marcus's point, our youth know, whether they are young children like mine or they are children who are emerging into college and adulthood, they know what they need and want, but they also must be operating in a place where we're not scared to tell the truth.
So, last question people should applaud that. Absolutely. Last question, somebody wants to know, what are ways to get involved to reduce the wealth gap in Minnesota and to go to the name of this program, Build Black Wealth in Minnesota?
Sure. So there's getting involved is you have to get involved. You have to know what's going on in your community. And there's three areas that I really think that are important for us to just think about and figure out what our role is. One, how do we correct the harms of the past? You know, I think about what St. Paul is doing with their inheritance fund and how they're investing in black homeowners that were descendants of those that lost their homes in Rondo back in the day. And like, how can you get involved in efforts that support like the Rondo Land Trust or other places that are supporting home ownership? I think about the second part around how do we invest in systems change? How do we get involved in efforts that are coalition approaches where you can lend your legal advice or your legal support or other things that you can offer up to these coalitions, such as Groundbreak Coalition, where they're looking to gather $4 billion of capital to impact home ownership, business development, commercial real estate, and affordable housing. Like, how can you and your company get involved in coalitions such as that? And then lastly, how do you protect the progress? I'm going to say that 3 more times: protect the progress, protect the progress, protect the progress. Use your minds in your positions to ensure that we're not going backwards in time, but we're going forwards, and we're protecting the things that we have that we can start to build on.
Learn the things you don't know. Those places and conversations that start to make you feel uncomfortable because of a lack of knowledge, not because it isn't terrain that you should be working in. So spend time learning, spend time reading, ask the questions that feel like, as the 5th graders told me today, this is a weird question. That was a preface before everyone that came. None were weird questions. We have to get comfortable as adults, as leaders, as executives, asking those questions of one another. You might have 1 or 2 people who get offended, but I trust you, the vast majority of people will sense the intent that's coming behind it and want to lean in. So that's my first one. The second is take daily action. We will not undo hundreds of years of systemic racism in Black History Month. We won't undo it only with programs like this. I tell my white colleagues and friends and clients, if you're not having the same conversation with your family, with your friends, with the folks you golf and swim with, that you have with me, we have 0 chance of moving the needle. It has to become a part of the job every day. Taking those actions. I have a friend who says, I have to go about this like I go about recovering from alcoholism. Every day waking up and saying, what am I going to do today to undo systemic racism? And looking myself in the mirror tonight to say, did I do all I could do? And if the answer is no, pledging that tomorrow is a day where I stand up even taller, even more bold, even more loud. I use all the resources and relationships that I have. And my third is invest, invest, invest. Invest your time, invest your talent, invest your dollars, invest your influence. There are tools available to help organizations, but people need to hear not just from folks who look like us, but from folks who look like many of you, and even more, to say this matters to me. If you spend your dollars somewhere, be sure you understand what their policies are and whether or not they're advancing equity or they're advancing harm. And if they're advancing harm, move your dollars. You have influence. If you work somewhere, ask deeper questions. Every VP I meet with, I say, is equity and inclusion here? Can every person advance despite their race or ethnicity? Immediately, everybody says, and then the head nodding gets slower as they think, well, I can, but I don't know about her or him, whatever the other is. We have to become more comfortable about asking and demanding for equity and for results from that equity.
On that note, can you all please join me in doing a big round of applause to Tawanna Black, Marcus Owens, for this tremendous performance. This was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you both so much for sharing all of this with us. Thank you, thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over, President of Twin Cities Diversity in Practice, Sumar Sharif. Thank you so much here. Please, a big round of applause for Sumar. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to just go over here. I just wanted to thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. And really I want to thank Tawanna, Marcus, and Tane. That was such an inspiring and insightful conversation. I know I'm walking away with several to-do items. And I hope that you'll all think about at least one thing that you can start doing tonight or just onwards, right? Whether it was from Tawanna's great slideshow about all of the data she presented, or from like Marcus's plea that we can't stop the progress, we have to continue the progress forward. Just think about at least one thing that you can take back from today. So thank you all for your insights. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all of you who are here in this room. We had to add extra chairs in the back. That was awesome. We have lots of people who are also online, which is wonderful. Thank you all for coming out and for just opening your minds and hearts and to come here in the spirit of being able to learn. On your tables, there are QR codes. If you are able to, please consider making a donation to Westminster and to Wild. We are made possible by the people who support us. It takes a good deal of effort in order to put together a great program like this, so please consider doing that. There's also a link using the same QR code to our feedback survey. We do read the surveys, we look at the data you provide, and we are always hoping to do even better next time. You can learn more about Tawanna and Marcus's work. Follow them on social media. Take a look at their websites and profiles, and please share that information with other people you know. I'm also going to give a huge thank you to all the Westminster staff who made this possible, including Mary, Keith, John, and Tane. There's a whole team here who does this. I'd like to thank especially my staff as well at Wild. Lalinda Zhang, where are you, Lalinda? Oh, she's in the lobby working. Lalinda Zhang is our Wild program manager. There she is in the back. She is the one who made all this possible. Marcus and I were talking earlier, and he said, yeah, we started planning this last June. We did. It takes a long time to make this happen. So thank you to you, Lalinda, and to Sophia, who is online. Both of them really were the backbones of this program. And finally, I want to thank our two program champions, Neera Chatterjee and also Roshan Rajkumar. They are on the board of directors for Wild, and they are the people who also devote their time to making this program area possible. So thank you again, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and please be sure to follow us and to keep your eyes open for our next program. Have a good evening.